So as always, I'm following Jeff in almost every respect in our work. You know, in 2000, I took over the training position at CPCS, the Public Defender Division of CPCS, and my job is essentially to train the full-time salaried public defenders as well as the private lawyers who do appointed work, at least in the beginning stages of their certification programs, the certifications they need to get onto our list to begin to take cases. And in 2000, there happened to be a Train the Trainer, and Jeff was a baby trainer, as was I. We were there in Missouri with Kat Kelly and Ira Mickenberg and a lot of other wonderful, wonderful teachers at Monahan from Kentucky. And I will never forget Jody English, who was there teaching. She's a fabulous trainer, a fabulous lawyer. And she said something that has stuck with me ever since, and that is that we do not train our new lawyers on the backs of poor people. We do not train our new lawyers on the backs of poor people. And what I realized is that when you're hiring new lawyers to come in and work in indigent defense, there's just no way around it. They're going to make mistakes. That's part of the learning curve. And what you're trying to do is enable people and empower people through culture and through the skills and knowledge to be able to reach out to the broader community that is the office and the criminal defense bar in your community, to be able to get the answers, to be able to get the supervision, to have the support so that as few mistakes as possible happen on the backs of our poor individual clients. Training is a huge component of reform. There's no question about that. The practice of criminal defense has become so much more complex than it was, 15 years ago. You have to become an expert not only in the substantive law and the procedural law that applies to criminal cases, but you have to learn about immigration consequences. You have to learn about science, both the hard sciences and forensic sciences, but also the soft sciences, psychological sciences. You have to become an expert in addiction science, which is a science, and it is an illness. And you have to learn about that. You have to learn about mental health and the consequences of various types of mental illnesses on human behavior. You have to learn about the devastating consequences that flow from a conviction or an adjudication of delinquency if you're a juvenile in Massachusetts, that's what we call it. And really, in some respects, sometimes the least of those consequences is the deprivation of your freedom, the loss of your freedom. The collateral consequences for voting, for getting a job, for immigration, either being deported or denied reentry. Driver's license. If you get arrested for a simple possession of drugs in Massachusetts, you will lose your driver's license, which is crazy, right? If we're talking about people who want to rehabilitate themselves and be productive members of society, be able to support themselves and their families, they lose their driver's license. Housing. If you're in public housing, you lose your public housing. And the thing is that also causes families to split. Because what happens is, if you are convicted, if you're the 17-year-old kid, now 18, thank God, year old kid in Massachusetts convicted of a crime that qualifies, like possession of drugs, you are going to cause your family to split up. They're either going to lose their housing or you are going to be thrown out into the street. And so it splits up families in horrific ways. You become ineligible to become a foster parent. So if someone in your family has a problem or a medical problem or is unable to take care of their kids, you will not be, even though you're a stable, good person, you will not be eligible to be that child's foster parent. We have had huge consequences in the criminal justice system as a result of criminal defense lawyers, I'm going to say public defenders, not knowing what they need to know about the forensic sciences. We've had huge hits on the accuracy of the, quote, results of criminal justice, because we've had junk science paraded in front of juries that persuaded them of our client's guilt, only to find out years later through exonerations when cases where people were lucky enough to have biological evidence still available for testing, to be exonerated through that DNA testing. We've had fraudulent lab practices, negligent negligent lab practices that have really had a huge impact. You have to know about the science of memory. You have to know about identification, eyewitness identification, and it's a huge topic. I'm so grateful because, and I'm so grateful to you, Jeff, for saying what you said about public defenders, because I see in the room Radha Natarajan and Josh Racer-Clone, who both work at CPCS, are both fabulous attorneys. Radha's only here because this enormously complex case, which I won't get into for confidentiality reasons, wound up being continued today, but doing absolutely first-rate, cutting-edge litigation in that case. And that is the kind of stuff that we need to know. We have to know about the structural discrimination that is built into the system. In order to bring a challenge to the way in which juries are selected in Massachusetts, that is a huge undertaking. And you have to know statistics, and you have to learn, I mean, the stuff you have to learn for that is just crazy. You have to know about the disproportionate impact of stop and frisk type policies, and the disproportionate impact of sentencing practices that disproportionately punish people of color and bring people of color into the system. You have to know that your chances, if you are a family that's struggling to raise your children, that the chances of your children being taken away from you if you are people of color are hugely larger than if you are a similarly situated white family, and that those children will be taken away for a longer period of time. And so you have to know all of this. And that is a training issue because you don't learn a lot of this in law school. And so as public defender trainers, you know, we have a community, thank God. You know, I'm part of a community with Jeff and with Steve. And what's your name, Doug? And we support one another and we share our resources, and we try to, when we figure out things and good speakers and good ways of teaching, we try to share that with one another. And so my entrance into that was back in 2000 when I first met Jeff Sheriff. So when we try to train our lawyers, we try to train not only on the substantive, the procedural, the collateral consequences, the cultural competence, the probation revocation law, sentencing law, forensics science, as well as advocacy skills that empower people to do real storytelling about our individual clients in every case. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to empower our lawyers to do. But I have to say that all of that kind of content approach to training, as important as it is, and it is critically important, is not nearly enough. Because, you know, I look at this quote, and Radha and Josh have seen this quote before, and I think about how Chesterton's talked about how the horrible thing about all legal officials, even the best, about all judges, magistrates, barristers, detectives, and policemen is not that they are wicked, some of them are good, not that they are stupid, several of them are quite intelligent. It is simply that they have got used to it. Strictly, they do not see the prisoner in the dock. All they see is the usual man in the usual place. They do not see the awful court of judgment. They see only their own workshop. And the reality is that when you are a line public defender and you go into court, I don't care how well trained you are, there is a way in which, if you are not careful, each and every day, a piece of your soul gets taken away and dies. You can't hear stories like the stories we've been hearing all day today and care about your clients and see them be stepped on and treated badly and not lose a piece of yourself to that. You can't be in a situation that Missy was in that probation surrender hearing, the part of the story that I think is probably missing here is the fact that that client spent time in custody waiting for his appeal to be won. And you know what? She did great work, and she made change in the system, and that's what we're all about. But the cost to that client was he sat in jail. And believe you, having met Missy, I can tell you that fact was not lost on her. So when we think about training as being this way of accomplishing reform, we think about it as accomplishing reform on the individual level for each and every client that is going to benefit the representation and therefore the way the criminal justice system behaves towards that client and their families and the communities in which they live. And we see the reform of indigent criminal defense as being about reform of the system that processes them and changes in the law. One of the things I'm proudest of in Massachusetts is that most of the major changes in the law that relate to, for example, eyewitness identification came through public defender division cases. And Radha has picked up the reins on that piece of our work. But all of the major changes came through public defenders who saw the issues, identified the issues, litigated the heck out of those issues, and preserved them, and changed the law. And we're on the cusp of another major accomplishment, in part through the work not only of Radha, but of all of the public defenders and indigent defense lawyers in Massachusetts on eyewitness identification. The thing is that we have the ability to reform the system through changing, as you talked about, changing the law and the evidence, making sure that the law and the evidence actually does matter to the result in the case, and not the systemic processing of groups of people, the move it along mentality in courtrooms, the you can appeal me mentality in courtrooms, which is at its greatest in misdemeanor cases and in probation cases because they think they won't be appealed because the cases aren't, quote, important enough. And so, there is this way in which all of the substantive law and procedure and all of that, the skills training we do is important, but it's not enough because we have to also train to community. We have to train to the sense of mission that Steve was talking about first thing this morning, about how they are not in it by themselves, that when they stand up to a judge who is being unfair and arbitrary and capricious and outrageous, that they can say no and know that people will have their back, and that when they come back to the office, they're not going to be criticized for what they did. They're going to be praised for it and supported for it. They need to know that when they hit a problem like that and they're losing their will and their spirit, that there are people they can call and turn to for advice and for help. And so we are training not just to the skills and to the substantive knowledge, but the reform also has to be a training of the spirit and a training to support the values that we believe in and to help people with the resilience they need to stay through this on the long haul. Norma Wassel is sitting here in the room. She's in charge of the social service advocates who work at the Public Defender Division. Now, not through her work for us, but on her own, as a member of a community and as a person who has been resilient over the long haul, she helped bring to Massachusetts what's called the Massachusetts Bail Fund. And the Massachusetts Bail Fund was established on those low misdemeanor cases where people are held on $100 or $200 or $300 bail and cannot post the bail and will have every aspect of their lives devastated. And when you watch Gideon's Army later, you'll see June Hardwick talking to a client where that's exactly what happened to her. She lost her house, everything. She lost everything because of being held on this low-level case. Well, what Norma did was she brought this bail fund to Massachusetts, and it's a nonprofit charitable thing, and people contribute. And so when somebody's being held on a bail like that, they will post the bail for the client in a way that we as lawyers can't do because the rules of ethics prevent us from doing that. And so our impact is not just about the impact we have in our offices, and in the court system, but it's also in the broader community. And this is the threat that training cannot fix, is the resilience problem. Because even though we try to train to the heart and the spirit and the values and the courage and have people's back and have their and support them, I'll tell you that as a member of the core faculty at Gideon's Promise, we trained at the beginning, we talked a lot about the gold standard of representation, what the gold standard is in defending someone in a criminal case. And 6 months later, when we got back together with the class, it was clear that we had badly miscalculated in some important respects that surprised us. And that is that when you train to the gold standard, and you train to the gold standard in a place where their resources do not exist to allow you to do your work at gold standard, that lawyer has had the veil ripped from their eyes. They see the injustice for what it is. And it is massively destructive to the spirit. It makes it harder for them to stay. And so we've changed the way we talk about gold standard, and we've in Gideon's Promise, where people are working in truly, truly broken criminal justice and indigent defense systems. So there's the training to the spirit. But you have to remember that you have to be realistic about what the situation is these lawyers are actually facing. We heard a lot of talk about triage today. In places like that, you can be a Missy Goldman, you can be a Rada or a Josh. You can be doing your level best, but be forced by the circumstances there into triage. And so what we try to help people to do is identify situations where they can triage and make a change in the system. The second major threat that training cannot fix is the threat that in Massachusetts I'm feeling much more acutely and painfully than I have in a very, very long time. With this huge expansion that Anthony told you about earlier today, we now have so many more lawyers, and most of them are new lawyers right out of law school. And so the percentage of people who are experienced of 10 years or longer, who really have deep knowledge and deep expertise and great skills, is so diluted now that I see that as a huge threat. And the thing that's really disappointing and difficult about this is because when the legislature told us expand, what they didn't do was fund us after they told us to expand. And so we are in a situation right now where we're in this quasi-hiring freeze where people are leaving and we're not filling their jobs so that we can avoid layoffs and furloughs. But the real problem behind all of that is that our salaries are so outrageously low that people cannot stay. We are losing every day. I trained 20 new lawyers in September. And during, on the night when we were celebrating them doing their mock trial and finishing the course successfully and all of that good stuff, and it was a wonderful night, on another part of town, there was a party going on for 4 public defenders who had been with us less than 3 years who were leaving. Not because they don't want to do the work, not because they've been so beaten down, but because they can't afford to stay. And when you factor in the cost of student loans and how much of that, what a huge percentage of the salary is going just to the student loans, people cannot live. And so they're leaving us and going to other public defender agencies, which really, really pisses me off. I'm willing to share, but not my peeps, you know. And so that is the other big threat to this, is that we are not making it possible for people to stay in the work. So Jeff Shear developed, and I'm grateful to him for this because he this way of thinking was, I think, first explicitly talked about by Charles Ogletree and Abby Smith. And it's been out there for a long time about what it is that brings people to the work and will keep them connected and keep them resilient to stay over the long haul. And it's what Jeff has explicitly helped us to bring into our training, and he's had an effect throughout the country with this. And that is, when we think about client-centered representation, people come to the work and there are the humanists, we used to call the social worker, but I didn't quite get to it, but the people who are in the work because they want to make a difference in individual clients' lives, and that's what really excites them and sustains them. There are the people who are the warriors, like Travis Williams, who you'll see in the movie in a little while, who just want to smash the government in the face for every injustice they commit and fight like hell at trial for every single client. And then there are the people who are the activists or the system change people who want to change the law and change the way the system deals with poor people and with criminal defendants, particularly poor people. And what Jeff has helped us to think about trying to train on is that when you are in one of these areas and things aren't going well, if that's what your default is, to remember that these other two pieces are part of the work, and that when you can latch on to that and sustain yourself, that can be a way to sustain yourself over the longer haul. And so I guess what I wanted to leave you with is the idea that while Chesterton's reality is the reality in a great many courtrooms, that through training and through supporting the lawyers, not at the expense of clients, that Steve was talking about earlier, about the distinction between helping lawyers not being the same thing as helping clients. When you make it possible for people to stay over the long haul, you are helping the lawyers and you are helping them help their clients, because that's where you develop the skills and the expertise and the deep knowledge that's necessary to do this work well, one client at a time, one case at a time. And so my hope is that by taking these kinds of approaches and supporting funding for salaries and debt relief, student loan debt relief, that the wonderful work we do in training and supporting people will take hold and over the long haul. And we will, one day at a time, make a big change to the system. Rob is going to talk with you about my Gideon. I also want to thank the Hamilton Institute for funding this website. Massachusetts we've put a lot of energy into building this website for our people, and it is, as you're going to see, it's a very impressive thing. I'm also very grateful to Harvard, because over the years I've been able to come to a number of conferences that dealt with issues relating to criminal justice and the fairness of the system. We have a way of holding these issues up to the light that I think benefits us all. So thank you very much for your time and attention.